productive forces aren't like that. All new productive forces don't do that. Rather than dividing and crippling and otherwise harming producers, wouldn't the productive forces introduced by the associated producers be oriented toward the development of their capacities, toward the development of real, of rich human beings? Just as capital develops productive forces which serve its goals, the specific productive forces developed in a society of associated producers would reflect, quote, that inverse situation in which objective wealth is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development, end of quote. In other words, this inversion of the capitalist inversion necessarily involves the protagonistic democracy in the workplace that breaks down the division between thinking and doing. It necessarily involves a change in the economic structure of society that allows productive forces to increase with the all-round development of the individual. But what happens if you ignore the specific way in which productive forces relate to relations of production? Ignore the link between productive relations and particular productive forces developed within them, and then all that matters is the expansion of productive forces without regard for their particular joint product. Ignore the character of productive relations and their effect upon the development of human capacities, and you are led logically to the introduction of Taylorism. You are led logically into the capitalist factory. You are led logically into the Chinese road of building up capitalism in order to someday have productive forces that will allow you to go to the next stage. In other words, the protagonism in the workplace, which is an investment in human capacities, then becomes simply a matter for the higher stage. And meanwhile, the production process that you have does the job of producing alienated and emptied out workers who must possess more and more commodities. This brings us to the third reject. Third, it's necessary to reject the proposition that distribution in accordance with contribution is what Lenin called, quote, the socialist principle, close quote. That was a serious misinterpretation and misapplication of Marx's critique of the Gotha program. The inevitable defect that Marx identified in socialism as it emerges was here transformed from a defect into a principle. Rather than a distribution relationship that had to be reinforced, for Marx, this defect was a historical premise that had to be subordinated. And the precise nature of that premise, that defect, was the continued existence of an exchange relationship. An exchange not of commodities, but of one's labor with society. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he gets back in another, close quote. It was an exchange between an owner of what Marx referred to as the personal condition of production of labor power in the critique of the Gotha program, and with the person who owns the use values he desires. And Marx noted here about the character of this exchange, quote, the same principle prevails as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. A given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form, close quote. In other words, the principle is, exchange, give me this, I'll give you that. Give me this which I want, and you shall have what you want. That's the principle of exchange of equivalents, of exchange. And of course, that principle, the quid pro quo, also implies its opposite. If I don't get the equivalent, then you're not going to get what you want. So in other words, if members of society relate to each other as owners of their own labor power, each seeks to maximize income for a given amount of labor, or to minimize labor for a given amount of income. That continuation of bourgeois right, of course, immediately reveals that solidarity is not the bond between members of society. The only thing that matters in such a social relation is how much of labor an individual has contributed. Because of the inequality, too, of the capacities owned by the individual producers, this exchange relationship is necessarily marked by inequality in distribution. Marx unequivocally condemned this relationship as an entirely one-sided perspective. He pointed out, this is again from the Critique of the Gotha program, that it, quote, tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment and thus productive capacity as natural privileges, end of quote. In other words, by this standards, those who own greater productive capacity are entitled to get more. Nothing else matters. Individuals, and Marx said, individuals unequal in their capacities are considered, quote, from one definite side only. For instance, in the present case, are regarded only as workers, and nothing more is seen in them, everything else being ignored, end of quote. Well, this sounds very familiar to anyone who's read Marx. It's exactly what he criticized the political economists in 1844 for. He said about the political economy then is that this conception of distribution looks upon the producer, quote, only as a worker. It does not consider him when he is not working as a human being, close quote. Everything in this concept of distribution in accordance with contribution is ignored except that they are owners. And Marx's critique of that particular exchange in socialism as it first emerges mirrors his earliest critique of the political economy of capital, which begins from the premise that we're separate, that the community of human beings is at its core a relationship of separate property owners. He wrote about this political economy in 1844 that, quote, it starts from the relation of man to man as that of property owner to property owner, close quote. The relation of exchange he went on to talk about in the Grundriss is a relation which presumes that despite the overall dependence of producers on one another, they're separate and isolated, and that what exists is, quote, the total isolation of their private interests from one another. We engage in exchange out of our self-interest, but what kind of people are produced in this relationship which begins from the separation of man from man? Very clearly, people who remain alienated from each other, from our activity, from our own products. The alternative Marx envisioned in the Grundriss and in 1844 is the association of man with man, where there's, quote, communal activity and communal enjoyment. Activity and enjoyment which are manifested and affirmed in actual direct association with other men. And as Marx indicated in the Grundriss, quote, a communal production, communality, is presupposed as the basis of production. The labor of the individual is posited from the outset as social labor, end of quote. Well, there's more quotes, but I'll skip some. What is so obvious here is the joint product characteristic of this relationship. In consciously developing communal relations and producing directly for others, we not only satisfy the needs of others, but we produce ourselves as rich human beings. The process of developing socialism as an organic system is a process of developing this communality. How could we ever think that socialism would develop based upon a principle that views members of the society, quote, only as workers and nothing more is seen in them, everything else being ignored, end of quote. That's again the Critique of the Gotha program. And this one-sided conception, Marx recognized, does not look upon producers as human beings. It stands in contrast to a different principle, which he refers to in the Critique of the Gotha program, and that is what a person is entitled to in his capacity as a member of society. The new principle of distribution, which socialism introduces, the true socialist principle, it expands, again from the critique, quote, that which is intended for the common satisfaction and needs in proportion as the new society develops, end of quote. So the point we need to draw from the Critique of the Gotha program is, of course, that socialism inevitably emerges with defects that it inherits from capitalism. But it does not develop by building on those defects. Rather, its development into an organic system, quote, consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself or in creating out of it the organs which it still lacks, close quote.